A humble schoolboy spends his last few coins to buy coffee for a stranger in a suit. What he doesn't know is that the man is a millionaire, and that small act of kindness will change his life forever. What happens next will leave you stunned. "Wait, sir, you forgot your wallet?" shouted a young boy named Daniel as he chased after a well-dressed man leaving the small-town coffee shop. His voice carried urgency, but also a sincerity that caught the man's attention. The gentleman turned, startled, and saw the boy holding up a leather wallet. For a moment, he looked confused, as if he couldn't even remember setting it down. The man, in his early 60s, looked tired and distracted. His hair was neatly combed, but his eyes seemed heavy, as though sleep had been a stranger for many nights. His expensive suit, polished shoes, and gold watch hinted at wealth, but his face carried the weight of sadness, an invisible burden that no material possession could hide. He had indeed forgotten his wallet on the counter, something he had probably never done before. When Daniel picked it up and handed it back, the man sighed deeply, his shoulders drooping as if the weight of the world rested on them. "Thank you, son. I don't know what's wrong with me today," the man said, his voice soft but strained. Daniel, only 19, smiled warmly. Despite his own struggles as a student who worked long hours at a local store just to pay his fees, he had a natural kindness about him. "No worries," Daniel said gently, his tone light, trying to ease the man's weariness. Then, after a short pause, he added something unexpected. "Actually, sir, let me buy your coffee today. You look like you could use a break." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You? Buy me coffee?" His voice carried both disbelief and curiosity. Rarely in his life had anyone offered him something so simple without expecting something in return. Daniel laughed nervously, scratching the back of his neck. "Yeah, it won't be much, but kindness is all I can afford." He opened his wallet and pulled out a few crumpled bills, the money he had carefully saved from stocking shelves at the store. It wasn't much, just enough for a small treat, but in that moment, Daniel was willing to give it away. The man hesitated, staring at the boy. His instinct was to refuse. He had more than enough money, more than this boy could probably imagine. But something about Daniel's sincerity, the genuine warmth in his eyes, made him pause. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he nodded. "All right, thank you." And so, Daniel walked to the counter, paid for the man's drink, and brought it back with a shy smile. The man took the cup, his fingers brushing against Daniel's hand for a brief moment. It was just coffee, ordinary, hot, and simple. But in that instant, it felt extraordinary, as though the world had shifted just slightly. That single cup of coffee, bought with wrinkled bills and offered with pure kindness, marked the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. For the man, it was the first time in years he felt truly seen. And for Daniel, it was the first step into a story that would change his life forever. As they sat at a quiet corner table, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wrapped around them like a warm blanket. For a while, they simply sat in silence, sipping slowly, each lost in his own thoughts. Then a man finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "My name is Richard." Daniel straightened in his chair and offered a polite smile. "I'm Daniel, just a college kid trying to make it through." He didn't say it to complain. His tone was matter-of-fact, even cheerful, though his tired eyes revealed how hard he worked just to keep up with tuition and rent. Richard studied him for a moment, his sharp business-trained eyes noticing the worn-out jacket Daniel wore and the scuffed shoes that had clearly seen better days. Yet, instead of embarrassment, Daniel sat with quiet confidence, the kind of self-assurance that comes from character rather than money. As the minutes passed, Richard began to open up. Words that had been trapped inside for years seemed to spill out effortlessly. He spoke about his past, about how he had built several companies across the country, about the empire he had created through hard work and relentless ambition. His voice carried pride when he described his accomplishments, but it faltered when he reached the present. But despite all of it, Richard admitted, setting his cup down with a sigh, "I've never felt so alone. Everyone around me wants something, money, favors, opportunities. No one just talks to me." His eyes seemed to glaze over, as though recalling countless boardroom meetings where smiles were painted on faces, but sincerity was nowhere to be found. Daniel listened carefully, his brow furrowing with empathy. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to offer solutions. He simply listened. When Richard finished, Daniel leaned forward slightly and said, "Sometimes, all we need is someone to sit with us. Not for money, not for favors, just to care." The simplicity of his words cut deeper than any speech or lecture could. Richard felt a strange warmth in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known in years. This boy, with nothing more than a few crumpled bills to his name, had given him something priceless, genuine kindness. For Richard, it was startling. People he had known for decades, employees who depended on his fortune, even so-called friends, none had ever looked at him the way Daniel just did. As a human being in need of connection, not as a millionaire. In that little coffee shop, surrounded by chatter and clinking cups, Richard realized something profound. Sometimes, it isn't wealth or success that fills the emptiness inside. It's the presence of someone who cares enough to sit, listen, and share a cup of coffee. After finishing their coffee, Richard leaned back in his chair and studied Daniel with curiosity. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in wonder. Finally, he asked, "Daniel, why did you really buy me that drink?" Daniel looked down at his cup for a moment, then shrugged with an easy smile. "Because you looked like you needed it. Life isn't about how much we have. It's about how much we can give." His words were simple, spoken without hesitation, and yet they carried a weight that struck Richard deeply. Richard smiled outwardly, but inside, his mind was racing. All his life, he had met people who calculated every action, what they could gain, what advantage they might secure. But this boy seemed different. Still, Richard was a man who had built empires by questioning motives. Part of him wanted to believe Daniel, and part of him wanted proof. The next day, Richard did something unusual for a man of his status. He returned to the same modest coffee shop, taking a seat by the window. For hours, he sat there waiting. When Daniel finally walked in, carrying a backpack stuffed with books and worn from use, Richard stood. "Daniel," he called, motioning toward the door. "Come with me." Daniel looked confused. "Sure. Where are we going?" Richard only offered a faint smile. "I want to show you something." Outside, parked along the curb, was a sleek black luxury car. Its polished surface reflected the morning sun like a mirror. Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief. "This is yours." Richard chuckled softly. "One of many. Hop in." The drive was quiet at first, Daniel staring out the window as the small town gave way to tall glass buildings. Finally, they stopped in front of a towering office complex, bustling with life. Men and women in suits hurried through the revolving doors, phones in hand, determination on their faces. Richard stepped out and gestured proudly. "This company is mine. I built it from the ground up." His voice carried pride, but also a trace of exhaustion. "But lately, I've been thinking of retiring. And when I do, I don't just want someone smart to take over. I want someone who understands kindness, someone who values people more than money." Daniel's eyes grew wide, his heart pounding. "Why are you telling me this? I'm just a poor student. I don't even know how a company like this works." Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Daniel could hear. "Because sometimes the most humble people are the ones who deserve the biggest opportunities. I want to see if you're one of them." Over the next few weeks, Richard kept his promise and slowly invited Daniel into his world. For a boy who had only ever balanced classes, part-time jobs, and late-night study sessions, stepping into the life of a millionaire felt surreal. Daniel sat in sleek boardrooms where decisions worth millions were made, walked through towering office buildings filled with hundreds of employees, and rode in cars he had only seen on posters. But despite the luxury surrounding him, Daniel never lost his natural humility. He listened more than he spoke, observed more than he judged, and asked questions with genuine curiosity. Richard, who had mentored countless business executives before, was taken aback. Daniel wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't chasing titles or status. When Richard allowed him to sit in on meetings, Daniel listened carefully, and when asked for input, he gave simple, heartfelt suggestions. Maybe instead of just measuring profits, Daniel once said, you could measure how happy your employees feel working here. A smile can be more powerful than a chart. The executives chuckled at first, but as Richard looked around, he saw heads nodding. Even seasoned professionals couldn't deny the truth in Daniel's words. Day after day, Daniel shared ideas that others overlooked. He spoke about creating an environment where workers felt like family, where their voices mattered and their struggles were heard. Instead of talking about numbers, he talked about people, reminding everyone that behind every desk and every report was a human being with dreams, fears, and families. His perspective was fresh, and his sincerity touched those who had long been buried in corporate routines. Finally, one afternoon, after an especially long meeting about company growth strategies, Richard stood up. His presence commanded attention. With Daniel by his side, he addressed the entire board of directors. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice firm yet emotional. This young man reminded me of something I had forgotten, that humanity comes before business. We can expand, we can grow, we can chase profit all we want. But if we forget people, we lose everything. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. From today onward, Daniel will be joining our leadership program under my personal guidance. He may not have a degree in business yet, but he has what many of us lost along the way, a heart that gives without expecting anything in return. The room erupted into applause. Some clapped out of respect, others out of genuine admiration for the courage it took to make such an announcement. Daniel, however, stood frozen, his face pale with shock. He could barely process what had just happened. After the meeting ended, as people congratulated him, Daniel leaned toward Richard and whispered, "Why me? You could pick anyone more qualified, anyone with experience." His voice trembled with both fear and disbelief. Richard smiled knowingly, his eyes filled with warmth. "Because you gave when you had so little. You bought me coffee without expecting anything back. That heart, Daniel, that's what the world needs. Skills can be taught. Degrees can be earned. But compassion, that can't be faked." Months later, Daniel's life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The boy who once counted every crumpled dollar now carried himself with confidence. Not because of the fine suits Richard had gifted him or the polished shoes he wore, but because he had discovered something deeper: purpose. Under Richard's mentorship, he learned more than the mechanics of running a business. He learned how to lead with integrity, how to balance ambition with humility, and how to never forget the value of simple kindness. But despite his new lifestyle, Daniel never forgot where he came from. The weight of his struggles, the late nights studying after long shifts, the days of worrying about bills, the times when even buying a sandwich felt like a luxury, kept him grounded. Whenever he traveled to big cities for meetings or attended elegant events filled with powerful people, he would quietly remind himself, "I am still the same Daniel who once bought a cup of coffee with his last few bills." That's why, no matter how far his journey took him, Daniel often returned to the small coffee shop where it all began. He would sit at the same corner table, order a modest drink, and watch as people came and went. Sometimes he even paid for a stranger's coffee, remembering the moment that had changed his own destiny. The staff at the shop grew to know him well, not as the rising businessman, but simply as Daniel, the kind young man with a generous smile. One quiet afternoon, as the two of them stood outside the shop, Richard placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. His eyes softened as he looked at the boy who had become like a son to him. "You thought you were just buying me a coffee," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "But what you really gave me was hope. That day, you reminded me of the goodness that still exists in this world." Daniel's chest swelled with gratitude, his lips curving into a smile. "And you gave me a future I never dreamed of," he replied. "It wasn't just about money or opportunities. It was about the chance to become someone who could make a difference." From that day forward, their story began to spread, inspiring everyone who heard it. People shared it as a reminder that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can open the biggest doors. A simple coffee, a small gesture, a few words spoken with sincerity. Those are the things that can change lives. And in the end, it was clear, life is not measured by wealth or power, but by the humanity we share, one cup of coffee at a time. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video. Thanks for watching.